let's hear all about chloride from Mr. David Bruns. Let's give him a big hand from the Santa Clarita Valley Sanitation District.
Thank you. As Alan said, my name is Dave Bruns. I'm the Assistant Department Head for Financial Management with the Sanitation Districts. And a lot of you are familiar faces. You've come to some of our information meetings. We've already had 4 of them starting a week ago, one last night, and as Alan said, we've got 2 more to go. But it's always nice to be invited, have the opportunity to say things, to answer questions, to interact with the community. That we realize this is an important issue. It really relates to what are the rates that are going to be set, how does it impact your wallet and your finances, and so it's your money, and so we really think it's important, so we appreciate the opportunity to be here. What I'm going to do tonight is a little different than what we did at the information meetings. For those of you who've been there, you don't want to hear it all over again. Alan's been there twice. I'm sure he doesn't want to hear it a third time. But so we're going to do a real brief summary of what we talked about at the information meetings. If you feel like you've missed it and you really want to see the whole thing, we did videotape it. We have it on our website, lacsd.org, and you can watch the whole information meeting. So it's always there, it's available. But what I'll do is kind of recap real quickly sort of what it is we're doing and the project and what the proposed rates are. And then Alan has, on your behalf, I think, asked a lot of different questions, both at one of our board meetings and then also at the last advisory committee meeting. He asked, went through our presentation, asked a lot of questions. And so what we'd like to do is we take those questions seriously, and as the old Radio Shack commercial goes, you've got questions, we've got answers. And so we want to try to answer those questions, provide you the information that you need. So with that, we've got some slides to kind of help orient people, to help explain what's going on. Did I lose my slides? Okay. Well, it's coming up. I can start. I mean, it's pretty simple. That again, I'll just start with who we are as the sanitation districts. That we're the agency that provides wastewater treatment. Oh, there we go. We provide wastewater treatment. We run the sewage treatment plants in Santa Clarita. We actually have 23 districts throughout LA County, but each district kind of being on its own Santa Clarita. So this is really what we're focused on. And while we treat sewage, and the majority of what we do is focused on operating and running the existing facilities, we also face regulatory requirements that we don't operate in a vacuum. That in the U.S., the way things are established, you have EPA kind of at the top setting regulatory requirements. They then delegate a lot of that authority to the state, in this case, the State Water Resources Control Board. And then in California, we're divided up into 9 regions, of which the LA region, Region 4, is the one that Santa Clarita is in. And they are the ones who issue us our permits and establish the limits and have established the chloride mandate. And so those are kind of the agencies that we have to respond to from a regulatory standpoint. And one of the toughest challenges that we face, and probably one of the toughest ones we faced ever, is this chloride mandate that they've imposed upon us. And what it really says is that in the effluent, the treated wastewater that comes out of our treatment plant, we have to meet a limit of 100 milligrams per liter. And if we don't meet that, then we're subject to state and federal fines just because you're out of compliance. And ultimately, those fines come back to the property owners because they are the ratepayers within the district. Now, at one point, we were fined $225,000 for being out of compliance. The Regional Water Board was threatening to fine us additional monies. That we avoided the immediate fines last October because our Board of Directors adopted the facility plan in EIR, saying that this is the chloride compliance project that we would move forward with. It really had 3 components. The first was UV disinfection, ultraviolet light, that would replace our existing chlorine facilities. This would reduce chlorides, plus it has some additional health benefits because it helps prevent chlorinated hydrocarbons from being formed. It would have microfiltration and reverse osmosis. This is basically a very fine membrane filtering system that allows the water to pass through, keeps the chlorides on the other side of the membrane. And then, but you have then a very concentrated brine you have to get rid of, and it's proposed that it would go through deep well injection. These are wells that are 1 mile to 2 miles below the ground surface, past the usable groundwater table, past the bedrock into confined areas that are already high in saline, you don't cause any additional contamination to the groundwater supply, and it would allow you to dispose of the brine. We've talked about the cost of this project being $130 million. One of the questions that's been asked several times, is that really the cost of the project? We always refer to it in 2012 dollars, but we know it's not going to be built until 2015, 2016. So is this really the right numbers? And what about if you're borrowing money, there's interest? So what is the real cost? The reason we always refer to the 2012 dollars, in the facility plan, you had to compare different alternatives. Each alternative may have a slightly different construction schedule, different parts get built at different times. So in order to be able to do a fair comparison between the alternatives, you bring them all back to present value, you pick a certain year, in this case 2012, and then you can make a fair comparison. For consistency purpose, so we always refer back to the facility plan number, the 2012 number. As we did the financial projections, though, we recognize that the project won't be built in 2 or 3 years. You have to go through design, you start to do construction, and ultimately construction doesn't occur until basically 2019. So you've got a lot of different years. We have inflated those, assuming a 3% inflation rate, we've inflated those costs forward to the time when they're constructed. We've also, for purposes of evaluating rates, have included interest, at whatever interest rate we have to borrow monies, we have to repay it. We've included all that interest in the repayment cost. But we always refer to the 2012 number just for consistency of what's in the facility plan. Okay, so we adopted the facility plan. We're not out of the woods yet. There's some things that have to be done so that the state doesn't come in and issue additional fines. The first is that we have to have rates adopted by July of 2014. The second is that we need an extension for the construction deadline. Right now it's May 2015. Even if we worked around the clock, we would never get the facilities constructed by May of 2015. So we have to have an extension. Now, you're wondering, what's the relationship between July of this year and May of 2015? And the bottom line is, to get that extension, there's a long process that both the state and the federal governments have to go through. A lot of different reviews, sending out drafts, reviews, approvals, more drafts, more reviews. And the process takes about 9 months, meaning that the Regional Water Board would have to issue their draft plan to incorporate the changes by August of 2014. It's kind of a working relationship where they're saying, and I think Alan referred to this when he talked last month, that the Regional Board is expecting to see good faith on our part if they're going to operate cooperatively. One of the things their staff has indicated to us, good faith effort, is that you've adopted the rates for the project. And so they pretty much have told us if we don't adopt the rates, they're not going to move forward with releasing the plan. And if they don't release their plans, then we don't get the extension, and then we're out of compliance. We asked for a couple things. One, obviously, is the extension of the construction deadline to go from May of 2015 to July of 2019. And then we've asked for 2 technical changes, and I'll put both of them up. Been some discussion, who should get credit for suggesting these. I'll admit I was not part of the facility planning process. I don't know who suggested them, but they're great ideas. Whoever suggested them should get the kudos for having suggested them. They didn't necessarily make it into the facility plan. Let me just touch upon what they are first, and then I'll tell you why they weren't in the facility plan and why we're pursuing them now and why that happened. The first is to average the chloride levels over a 3-month period. The reason for that, right now the requirement would be you have to meet the standard on a day by day instantaneous basis. Chlorides will be up and down from day to day. If you have to meet it on a daily basis, then you have to size the facility to treat that one day that had the highest chloride level. If you're allowed to average it over a 90-day period, 3 months, then you can make a much smaller facility. If we're not granted that, the cost of the project would be $13 million higher. The second thing, right now, the permit requires that you have to meet the standard individually at each of our Saugus and Valencia water reclamation plants. The proposal is that we would build all the facilities, all the MFRO facilities at Valencia, take some of the low chloride water, then send it up a pipeline to the Saugus plant, blend it in with their water, and both plants would individually meet the standard. I think everybody has agreed that that pipeline is an $11 million pipeline. Why can't we just average between the two plants? Why do we have to meet it individually each plant? And we agree with that. And so that would save us $11 million if the water board agrees with that. Now, when we did the facility plan, we were under the strict timeline that if we didn't meet the October deadline for the facility plan, we were going to get fined, we were going to be out of compliance, and all those things were going to happen. These two requirements, we have to have data substantiate the claims. That the water board isn't going to say, oh, you asked, sure, we'll give it to you. They want to see data. We didn't have the data at the time the facility plan was written, so the facility plan didn't include those things. Not because they're not valuable, not because we didn't value the input we got, but because we had to get the facility plan written. We still intended to pursue them, and in fact, we've gotten the data now. We've done the modeling to show that those two things are not going to cause adverse impacts, and we've presented that data to the water board, and they are definitely leaning, especially on the first one, we think they pretty much have agreed to that. The second one, they're seriously considering it. So again, kudos to whoever suggested it. It's a great idea, and it was just a matter of timing. How do we get it so that we can move forward? When we talk about proposed rates, the current rate for a homeowner right now is $247. We're proposing that the rates would go up $20 to $21 a year, up to $370 by fiscal year 1920, basically going from a little over $20 a month up to $30 a month. And you can see the amount attributable to the project is about $8 a month as we get out to 1920. What if the rates aren't proposed? Increased project cost. We don't get the averaging over the 90 days, so the project cost goes up $13 million. It's a bigger facility now. There's more O&M. A lot of that cost can be spread over a 30-year period, but what it has the net effect of doing is adding about 20% to the annual cost. So instead of $100 per year attributable to the project, it would be about $120. State and federal fines. There's a lot of different kinds of fines. The state has first, there are mandatory fines. These are ones written in state law. Even the Regional Water Board doesn't have any say over them. It says if you're out of compliance, they can fine you they have to fine you $3,000 a day for each plant, for each day it's out of compliance. That ends up being about $2.25 million a year for every year that we're out of compliance. Now, some people have suggested, well, at $2.25 million, I can go 60 years paying fines before we ever reach the $130 million. Why don't we just pay the fines? Well, the state has then what are just called discretionary fines, and they can fine you additional monies to give you the incentive to move forward. And typically what they do on those fines is they look at what was your avoided cost. If by not building the project, you didn't have to spend $4 million in O&M, well, then they fined you $4 million. Plus, they said just to really get your attention, we'll tack on another 10% on top of it. So they try to take away your economic incentive not to move forward with compliance. If that doesn't work, then the feds step in and they can levy fines, again, all as an attempt to get you to move forward. There's the potential for the loss of local control, that at some point the state and feds can come in and say, you as an agency, your board of directors, your staff, you're just not being compliant, you're deliberately not complying with regulatory requirements. They can step in and then take over control of the agency. You have the potential of all sorts of things that they could do then, but you've lost that local control. Ultimately, though, it all comes down to the valley property owners then get hit with all these costs because they are the ratepayers of the district. And the other thing that happens is that even though you pay all these fines to do all those things, the mandate never goes away, so you're still on the hook to build a project. Okay, as Alan mentioned, we've been having information meetings. I put the whole schedule up here. We've already had 4 of them. There's 2 more, one tomorrow night at Live Oak Elementary, the other next Wednesday at the Aquatic Center. For those of you who missed last Saturday, that was the grand tour of the treatment plant. So if you've missed the tour of the treatment plant, I'm sure that you all feel sorry about that. But that was the highlight for many people for their week, to go on a tour of a sewage treatment plant. And then again, June 30th, this is the public hearing, 6 p.m. at City Hall. This is the time where the board of directors will be there. One of the things we do is, from all the information meetings, we summarize the comments we received so the board is aware of everything that's happened. We record all the phone calls that have come in, protests that have been received, all that sort of thing. All that gets presented to the board. You have an opportunity to speak to the board as well. Okay, with that, now let me switch gears a little bit, go to some of the questions that were raised. They've been raised at one of our board meetings. They were also raised at your last meeting here. One of the questions, how can the number of sewage units be down? That they're actually lower this year than they were last year? And to answer that question, we really have to look at a couple things. First, we'll just talk about what a sewage unit is. For most people, a sewage unit doesn't mean anything. And we'll talk a little bit how we measure sewage discharge, and then we'll talk about the low water rebate program. Okay, sewage, we have to measure sewage because we got to know how much people are discharging. We actually we measure it in terms of what we call sewage units. It's made up of 2 things. One is the quantity, just how many gallons of sewage you have. The other thing we measure is the quality. What is the strength of your sewage? That somebody that has a lot of organic matter, someone that has a lot of solids, it just costs more to treat their wastewater because you've got to remove all that stuff. And so again, the cost should be proportional not just to how much, but how strong your sewage is. And so what we've defined is that a sewage unit is equal to the amount of sewage that comes out of the average single-family home. And then everybody else is proportional to that. Now, one of the questions that comes up is, well, how do you really know how much sewage I have? And I think Alan pointed out in his thing that we talk about knowing how much sewage you have, and we actually don't know. We have to estimate your sewage. And it's like, okay, well, why don't we know exactly how much you have? One of the options is you could go to metering. Let's meter. Don't we meter the water coming in? Let's meter the sewage going out, and then we'll know exactly what you're discharging. Problem is, metering sewage costs more than treating the sewage. That one of the problems is, coming out of your house, you have to have a pretty small pipe to have a meter to accurately measure your flows. Those meters tend to clog. They get, you have water, you have the water coming through, but you have paper, you have food, you have all sorts of stuff coming down the pipe, clogs your meter. 2 things happen. One, the meter clogs, it backs up into your house, which nobody wants. And second thing, every time the meter clogs, you're calling out a plumber to come out and fix it, and you're paying for that. The second thing is the sewage meters, even if they worked well, they would measure the flow, they don't measure the strength. So then somebody's got to come out, and I don't know that we want to, when I say we, meaning us as homeowners, go out and take samples and send them off to a lab and get them analyzed. We don't want to be bothered with that. So if we talk about metering, that not even counting the cost of installing the meter, which is obviously going to be a price for that, it would probably cost you $500 a year minimum just to maintain and to keep operating that meter. Well, what we've talked about here for treatment is $370 a year. Let's say you did meter and you found out that your sewage was half of what we estimated. Well, you'd be paying the $500 for metering plus another $185. You'd be paying $685. Well, by our estimating method, we're only charging $370. I mean, from an economic standpoint, it just doesn't make sense to even try the metering. And when we started the whole service charge program, going way back to the 1980s, we held a lot of community meetings, to how do we establish this program? What is the best way to go? And I think one of the things we got from the community, we want equity. We want to be as fair and equitable as possible, but we don't want to spend a lot of money on administrative costs because nobody benefits from that. And so the system that ultimately arose from that is that we estimate your discharge to eliminate the high cost of metering, and we do that by looking at land use categories, the type of use. Are you a single family home? Are you a restaurant? Are you a store? Whatever you may be. And then we also look at the size of your facilities. That obviously, if I have a big facility, chances are I'm putting out more sewage than if I have the same use but a much smaller facility. So we factor those two things in, and we estimate the amount of sewage that you're discharging. So, which leads us to the low water rebate program. It was highlighted in your Prop 218 notice that you were mailed. At one point it was referred to as fluff. We actually think it's an important factor simply because when we've done it in the past, people have claimed, well, it was in the fine print, I didn't know about the program. We wanted to take the opportunity, we're sending you a notice, make sure you're aware of the program. And what it does, the first thing, it recognizes that a lot of users may be discharging significantly less than the average. And so we want to give you credit for that. If you're way below that average, we don't want to overcharge you. It's not fair. It's not right to you for paying if you're discharging less flow. So it gives you an opportunity to receive a reduced charge. It actually saves money. One of the things that we do is that people talk about, well, why don't you use water usage to measure sewage? Then you get into the problems. Well, I've got a big yard and I do a lot of irrigation, so that isn't fair either. And we've modified the program so that we focus only on winter water usage so that we minimize the impacts of irrigation. It doesn't eliminate it entirely, but hopefully minimizes that so it's a more accurate measure. The other thing that we do, now it's a simple one-page application basically, and all you have to do is fill out your name, your parcel number, your address so we know, and send in copies of your water bills, and then we'll do all the rest. And in fact, in the back we have some claim forms if anybody wants one so they can apply for a reduced rate. This program has actually been very successful. We've had both on the residential and commercial side, we've had parcels that have applied for reduced rate, gotten fewer sewage units, and so when we talk about why are the sewage units down a little bit, it's because people have been taking advantage of the program and getting reduced charges. So we think that's an important thing that you're aware of. Okay, one of the questions that was asked, we talked about one of the cost-saving measures we've done is refinancing bonds, and the question came up, well, how did the refinancing of the bonds cause the debt service to drop to zero? Well, it didn't. And in fact, if it did, I would have signed up for my home mortgage. I'd love to refinance and get zero, but that's not what happened. In fact, if we look at the budget, this is only a portion of the budget because I wanted to blow it up so that you could actually read it. But if we look at the bond repayment right here, you see the repayment did go down. Now, it actually went down more than this because we refinanced bonds back in 2000, at least some of the bonds back in 2011, and so the reduction took place over a number of years. But at no time did the bond repayment go down to zero. It did decrease. And so let's, how much did we, financing the bonds we saved? Some of the bonds were refinanced in 2011, and we did it to reduce the annual payment. Just the same way when you refinance your mortgage, you get a lower interest rate, and it reduces your monthly payment. We did exactly the same thing. In 2013, we had additional bonds we refinanced, And instead of reducing the annual payment, we reduce the term so that we pay them off sooner, cut down the amount of interest we have to pay. What did it mean in terms of savings? About $115,000 annually. If you take it over the remaining life of the bonds, just add up all the savings, including the shorter term, it saves about $8.5 million. If you bring it back to present value, it's about $4 million that we eliminated from costs that would be ultimately come back to you, the ratepayers. So, what did go from the $750,000 was asked in the question down to zero? Well, I think what it was, if we look on the revenue side, not the expenses side, but on the revenue side, and we look at the line that says loans. Now, these are loans. These are state revolving fund loans, not bonds. And you see we had about $750,000 in 2013-14, and it goes down to zero in 14-15. Well, why is that? Well, we were using the state revolving fund loan program to finance the Valencia WRP steam boiler upgrade. That project was completed and finished in 13-14. So we borrowed money in 13-14 to pay for it. Well, the project's done. You're not going to keep borrowing money to pay for a project that's already done. Hence, the loans have dropped to zero in that year. But that's on the revenue side, not on the expenses side. Okay, another question that was asked, based on what we're proposing as a rate increase for this coming fiscal year, that we're only going to collect an additional $1.5 million, and yet we're proposing that we're going to spend $5.3 million on the chloride project. Well, where's the other $3.8 million coming from? Did it just magically appear? Well, if we were adding, on top of everything else, just adding $5.3 million, you'd be absolutely correct. We're $3.8 million short. But let's go back to the expenses side, and instead of just focusing on the one project, let's look at the total capital budget. And in the total capital budget in 13-14 was about $6.2 million. In 14-15, it goes up to $8.2 million. It only went up $2 million. Well, where'd the other 3.3 go to? Well, it's because other projects that were being funded in 13-14 have dropped off the list. They're no longer there. The service charge rate was already collecting money to pay for that, so it just moves over to the chloride project. So you really only need to increase your revenues in this year to pay for that by $2 million. $1.5 million of it coming from the service charge. The rest of it coming, we track all of our revenues, that the amount of property tax revenue we went up based on actual receipts in 13-14, 12-13, and in 13-14 are about $700,000 higher than we had originally anticipated. And so again, that would cover that extra $2 million. Okay, another question. Why are we using such a low inflation rate when all the past years have had such a high inflation rate? And what it looked at, and the question was based on, if you look at these years, or basically over about the last 10 years, yeah, the service charge rate went up pretty significantly, quite a bit higher than inflation. We only ran out to 2011. These are slides we actually did 3 years ago, because the same question came up 3 years ago, and it's the same answer, so we recycled the same slides. We had some debate as to whether it's 11% a year increase. We think that because if you count the compounding nature of inflation, that it's actually about 7.9%. Some minor disagreement there. But either way, it's still significantly above the rate of inflation. So what happened? Well, we think a couple things. One, this is a narrow snapshot. Let's go back and look at it over a longer period, a 20-year period. And what you'll see, we had years where the rates were either very flat or, in fact, were flat. Other years where it was more significant. If you just look at the rate increase from 1994 to 2011, the rate only went up about 4% per year, much, much closer to the rate of inflation. So you have to be careful what snapshots you take. If I take it during the years where it went up significantly, yeah, it looked really good. If I had taken the snapshot when the rates were flat, oh, there's no inflation at all. So you have to be careful. So we wanted to take a much longer term. And in fact, if you looked at the inflation rate, you can see our rates did go up about 4%, slightly higher than what inflation is. But one thing that occurred in around 2003, 2004, the state had another one of its infamous mandates, this time related to nitrogen. And specifically, they were looking at two compounds. One would be ammonia, the other would be nitrates, both of which are known in certain concentrations to have human health effects. So there was a lot more impetus to do the project, and in fact, the board approved it. The project was built. It had both a capital component. We had to build some facilities to remove the nitrogen, and then there's also an increased operating expense. This process is known as nitrification, denitrification, or NDN. But what happens if, oops, I've lost it now. Can I get my slides back? Sorry about that. What happened is that there's a discontinuous jump, and we'll see this in a moment on the slide. But basically what happens if you make an adjustment in the inflation rate, okay, perfect, thank you. When that NDN facility came online, if you make a discontinuous jump, say, yeah, it went up, but it went up because we have a new mandate, not because of inflation, not because of other things that we did. It was just something that the state mandated we do. And then you continue up at the rate of inflation, you'll actually see that over that same time period, our service charge rate went up slightly less than what the rate of inflation would have gone up at. So I think you have to be careful when you look at those numbers. But nonetheless, that's all in the past. That maybe explains the past. What's going to happen in the future? Well, in all of our rate projections, we've assumed an inflationary rate of 3% that applies to O&M and what we would call the routine capital projects. There's always capital projects that you're doing. In a treatment plant, you have to replace big pieces of equipment, bring in new pumps, various things on a routine basis. And so we think that, inflation at 3%, we could debate, is it good or bad? Obviously, right now, inflation has been less than 3%. Some years in the future, it may be higher, but we've assumed 3% per year moving forward. The SRF loans, the debt service the funding mechanism we're going to use to pay for the project, the majority of the project, to borrow the money, it's at a fixed interest rate, and hence the repayment won't vary over time. It's just in the same way that you have a fixed rate mortgage on your house, once it's fixed, your monthly payment is the same every month. It doesn't vary according to what inflation does. And so for that portion of it, there's really a 0% inflation rate because those costs are fixed and they will stay the same over the life of the loan. So when we talk about the rate of increase, that we're really looking at sort of a weighted average between the operational costs going up at 3% per year and the debt service staying at 0. So those are the things that we've built into our rates as we talk about moving forward. Okay, another question that was asked, haven't you been running at a deficit and using the CIF, that's the Capital Improvement Fund, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment, but to make up the shortfall that you've actually been running a deficit and just sort of hiding it. And where that comes from, you'll see a line that says transfer from Capital Improvement Fund, and you'll see that in these 2 years, and in fact most years, it's running around $4.5 million a year. Well, isn't that just borrowing and subsidizing your budget, and you're really running a deficit and not collecting enough money? Well, first of all, let's look what the Capital Improvement Fund is. It's a restricted fund that's used to pay specifically for expansion-related projects, that as new users come online or if existing users increase their discharge, they grow and they want to start discharging more, they pay a connection fee. And that connection fee is equal to the cost of building capacity to accommodate their new flow. That when we started the service charge program, one of the things the community said long and loud is, well, we don't really like paying service charges, we'd rather not, but we understand we have to. It's our sewage, we have to pay for it, but we don't want to subsidize growth. And so the connection fee is the attempt to capture the cost of expansion. We put those monies into a separate fund, the CIF or Capital Improvement Fund, and we put those monies in there until an expansion is needed. And then we withdraw those funds as needed to pay for expansion-related costs. So when you see in the budget that transfer from the capital improvement fund, that's really paying for expansion-related costs. And those could be either current costs in the year in which they're incurred, or in some cases where we've done an expansion and we used the state revolving fund loan to pay for the project, and now we have to pay the debt service. Since it was an expansion-related cost, we take the money out of the capital improvement fund. If we didn't, the service charge rate would have to increase, and then existing users would be subsidizing growth. Now, we do have a policy that does allow us to borrow from that capital improvement fund under specific conditions, and some of those conditions are that you have to pay the money back. You just don't get to take it. You have to pay it back, and you have to pay it back with interest. And it says, basically, we want to keep the fund whole so that you have to pay interest at whatever the fund would be earning. Right now, we all know interest rates, you're not earning much of anything. That we're only earning about 0.7%. For our budgetary purposes, we've assumed it'll be about 1.5%. Less than what we have to pay for the state, which is about 2.9%, less than what you'd have to pay for bonds, which could be as high as 6%. We've borrowed one time under this policy. We borrowed $5 million. It was a cash flow short-term cash flow situation. So we had one time we did borrow the funds, and now we're repaying it. And you can see in the budget, there's a line item on the expenses side that says Capital Improvement Fund loan repayment. So again, over time, we're repaying that loan with interest. It's not free money that you just get to take. Okay, but then one of the questions, well, where are connection fees headed into the future?